Hello, and welcome to the channel. I'm glad you're here, and I truly appreciate you listening today. If you enjoy the stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, let's settle in and enjoy today's stories. I'm not exactly sure what pulled me in. Maybe it was the thrill, the mystery, or the thrill-seeking impulse that made my skin buzz with excitement. But when Alex texted about the asylum, I didn't think twice. A chance to explore the old Glenmore Psychiatric Hospital, the place that had been abandoned for over 50 years, left to rot on the outskirts of town, was more than enough to break up the monotony of my everyday life. We met up in the dead of night, parked a mile away to avoid prying eyes, and gathered at the edge of the hospital grounds. The place was hidden deep in the woods, with rusted fences barely standing and signs warning trespassers to stay away. But as we made our way up to the main entrance, I felt that strange excitement again, the kind that blurred the line between fear and curiosity. The hospital loomed over us, a hulking beast of broken windows and peeling paint, shadows swallowing it whole. I could feel it even before we entered. Something was watching us. We forced open a side door, and the smell hit immediately. It was the stench of decay, stale and oppressive, hanging thick in the air. Our flashlights barely pierced the darkness, illuminating shattered tiles, graffiti-covered walls, and long-forgotten rooms with rusted beds and wheelchairs. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The deeper we went, the stronger it got. "Come on," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. "We'll be out before dawn." As we moved down the narrow corridors, I started to hear things, soft whispers, like voices carried on the wind. But there was no wind, only silence. A figure flickered in the corner of my eye, disappearing before I could turn my head. I dismissed it, convincing myself it was my mind playing tricks. But then, as we reached an old patient ward, I felt a cold hand graze my shoulder. I spun around, flashlight shaking, but there was nothing, just empty air. "Did you feel that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The others looked at me, their faces pale in the dim light, and nodded. There was something here with us, and it wasn't happy. The hospital's walls seemed to close in as we walked deeper into the belly of the asylum. Our flashlights barely cut through the thick darkness, casting long, trembling shadows. I noticed strange markings on the walls, faded, scratched words, carved with desperate hands. They were fragments of phrases, half-formed pleas. "Make it stop. Can't breathe. I hear them." I didn't want to think about who had written them. Alex was leading the way, his face set and determined, while Rachel and I stayed close behind. As we reached the end of a hallway, a faint noise drifted toward us. A soft, steady hum, almost like singing, but it wasn't any song I knew. The sound was unnaturally cold, prickling my skin and sending a chill straight to my core. Rachel's flashlight flickered, then went out entirely. "Damn it," she muttered, tapping it with a shaky hand. "I swear it was working fine." "Here, take mine," I whispered, handing over my backup light. I tried to ignore the feeling of eyes on the back of my neck, but it clung to me, heavy and suffocating. The singing grew louder as we continued down the hallway, winding deeper into the heart of the asylum. It seemed to follow us, bouncing off the walls like it was coming from everywhere at once. Finally, we found the source, a door marked Ward B. The handle was cold as I touched it, a chill that seemed to sink into my bones. Alex pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. It was a long, narrow room, filled with rows of decaying beds. Thin, grey light filtered through cracked windows, casting eerie shadows that shifted and stretched across the floor. The singing stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. The room felt occupied. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the air was thick with a presence, as if the patients themselves had never really left. That's when we noticed the beds. One by one, they began to creak, slowly tilting forward as if someone invisible was sitting up. Shadows moved over the beds, taking the shape of frail, sickly figures, their eyes hollow, their hands reaching out toward us. They seemed to be waiting. Rachel screamed, backing up against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. I tried to grab her, to pull her away, but my own legs felt like lead. A voice echoed through the room, low and filled with sorrow. "Help us," it whispered, so faint that I wondered if I'd imagined it. But the shadows didn't disappear. They just watched us, their eyes following our every move, their empty faces filled with something that felt like despair. Alex broke the silence. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. He turned and bolted back toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, it slammed shut, as if some unseen force had locked us inside. Panic surged through me. I ran to the door, yanking at it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows creeping closer, their voices merging into a low, steady chant, filling the room with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. I could feel their pain, their desperation, pressing down on me like a weight. They weren't just shadows. They were souls, trapped and lost, bound to this place by some terrible force. And they wanted something from us. The voices surrounded us, filling every corner of the room. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, a mixture of garbled words and tortured sighs. I glanced over at Alex and Rachel, their faces pale and frozen in fear. Then, out of nowhere, the chanting stopped, and a suffocating silence fell over us. Suddenly, I felt it, a cold, skeletal hand closing around my wrist. I froze, unable to move or even scream, as a voice whispered into my ear, so close that I could feel its icy breath. "Please, don't leave us." I jerked away, my heart pounding, but the hand held firm. I looked down, and for a moment I saw a face, twisted and contorted, staring up at me from the shadows. Its eyes were wide and empty, a hollow blackness that seemed to pull me in. I struggled, wrenching my arm free, and stumbled back against the wall, gasping for breath. The room spun, and I could feel the presence closing in, pressing in from every side. Rachel's voice broke through the fog in my mind. "Please let us go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We didn't mean to disturb you." For a moment, the shadows paused, their faces flickering with something like sorrow. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving only the cold, empty beds and the silence. But something had changed. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding, as if the asylum itself was watching us, waiting for us to make a move. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing for certain. It wouldn't let us go that easily. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, pulling Alex and Rachel toward the door. This time, it opened without resistance, as if the asylum was allowing us to leave, for now. We stepped into the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the silence. But as we walked, I felt a growing dread, a sense that we hadn't truly escaped. The asylum was alive, its walls filled with the memories of the broken souls who had been left behind, and somehow it had claimed a piece of us too. As we reached the main corridor, I glanced back one last time. The shadows were watching us, their faces pressed against the broken windows, their eyes filled with longing. I knew then that we hadn't just stumbled into an abandoned building. We had entered a place of suffering, a place where the dead were waiting for someone, anyone, to help them find peace. But that wasn't why they'd let us in. No, they'd let us in so they wouldn't have to be alone. Leaving Ward B, we tried to shake off the experience, convincing ourselves that it was nothing more than our minds playing tricks in the dark. But as we made our way down the corridor, something felt off. The hallways twisted and branched, an endless maze that seemed to change every time we looked away. No matter how many turns we took, every path felt wrong, like we were walking in circles, each hallway leading us deeper into the asylum's clutches. Then we heard them, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere behind us. Each step seemed to grow louder, closer, like something was following us, lurking just out of sight. "Do you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound. We picked up our pace, moving faster, but the footsteps matched us, keeping time with our frantic steps. I dared to glance back, my flashlight sweeping across the empty corridor. There was nothing there, nothing visible at least. Yet I knew we weren't alone. Whatever was following us, it wasn't bound by the same rules of reality we knew. The footsteps echoed closer, louder, until they seemed to surround us, like the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with the memories of those trapped inside. And then we reached a dead end. We turned, our backs against the wall, flashlights aimed down the corridor. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, one by one, shadows emerged from the darkness, faint figures, translucent and flickering, their faces blank and distorted. They moved slowly, their forms wavering like smoke, filling the corridor until there was nowhere left to run. I felt the walls closing in, the cold seeped into my bones, and I realized there was no escape. We were surrounded, and they weren't going to let us go. The figures closed in, their eyes empty, their hands reaching out as if to pull us into their endless misery. Desperation clawed at my chest as I fumbled for something, anything that might get us out of this nightmare. Then I remembered the strange markings we'd seen on the walls, the scratched words of former patients, pleas and bargains left behind by those who had tried to escape. It was a long shot, but I had no other choice. I understand, I stammered, my voice barely steady. I can help you, if you let us go. The figures paused, their faces flickering with something like recognition. One of them, a frail, hunched figure with hollow eyes, stepped forward, reaching out a skeletal hand. I forced myself to stay still as the icy fingers brushed my arm, an overwhelming wave of sorrow crashing over me. A voice echoed in my mind, not in words, but in raw emotion, a plea for freedom, for release from the endless suffering that bound them to this place. "Show us how," I whispered, barely able to speak. "Tell us what you need." The figure's gaze held mine, a silent agreement passing between us. In that moment, I knew what they wanted. They needed closure, a final act to release them from this purgatory. But what that act was, I didn't know. The shadows began to fade, retreating back into the darkness, but their presence lingered, filling the air with an unbearable sadness. We had been spared for now, but I knew they would return, and that if we failed to help them, they would drag us down into their misery, forever bound to this cursed asylum. We moved deeper into the asylum, searching for any clue that might help us understand the tragedy that had trapped these souls. In a dusty office, we found a stack of records, patient files, old and yellowed, covered in dust and grime. We skimmed through the pages, piecing together a story of neglect, abuse, and suffering. The asylum had been a place of horror, where patients were subjected to experiments, left in isolation and forgotten by the world. Many had died here, their stories erased, their names lost to time. But one file stood out, Patient 136. The record was incomplete, the last pages missing. But what remained hinted at something unspeakable. This patient had been subjected to the worst of the asylum's treatments, enduring years of torture before finally succumbing to madness. And in their final days, they had scrawled a message on the walls of their cell, a plea for anyone who might find it. I knew deep down that this patient was the key, the soul that bound the others to this place. If we could find their final resting place, maybe we could break the curse. But as I turned to tell the others, I saw the look of horror on their faces. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, taking shape, their eyes fixed on us with a hunger that made my blood run cold. They were waiting. Following the clues from the records, we made our way to the lower levels of the asylum, where the most difficult patients had been kept in isolation. The air grew colder as we descended, the walls narrowing, the darkness thickening until our flashlights barely made a dent. Finally, we found it. A small, windowless cell, the door rusted and barely hanging on its hinges. Inside, the walls were covered in scratches, frantic markings that told the story of a soul pushed to its breaking point. In the center of the cell lay a small pile of objects, personal items, left behind by those who had tried to help patient 136, each one carrying a faint trace of the person it once belonged to. Watches, bracelets, bits of jewelry, all left behind as offerings to a spirit that refused to rest. I felt a strange compulsion to add something of my own. Trembling, I placed my flashlight on the pile, a silent offering, a plea for mercy. The air grew heavy, the shadows thickening, swirling around us like a storm. And then, in the silence, I heard a voice. "Free us." The words were barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of every soul trapped within these walls. I knew what we had to do. We gathered in the cell, forming a circle around the pile of offerings, our hands clasped together, our voices steady as we began to speak the words that had been carved into the walls. It was a prayer, a chant, a desperate plea for forgiveness and release. The air crackled with energy, the walls trembling as if the very building itself was coming alive. Shadows rose around us, swirling, twisting, their faces filled with a mixture of hope and fear. As the final words left our lips, a blinding light filled the room, and I felt a wave of warmth wash over me, a release, a freedom, as the shadows began to dissolve, their forms fading into the light. One by one, the spirits lifted, their faces filled with peace, their souls finally free from the torment that had bound them to this place. The asylum seemed to breathe, the walls releasing a sigh, the darkness lifting as the last of the shadows disappeared. We stood in silence, the weight of the experience settling over us, knowing that we had witnessed something beyond our understanding, something that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. But as we made our way back to the surface, I felt a strange sense of peace. The asylum was no longer a place of suffering. It was a place of rest, a final sanctuary for those who had been forgotten. We left that night, leaving behind the horrors we had uncovered, but carrying with us the memory of those lost souls and the knowledge that somehow we had given them the closure they had longed for. Years later, I found myself drawn back to the edge of the woods, staring up at the old asylum, its windows dark and empty, its walls silent and still. The place had been closed off, condemned, left to rot. But as I stood there, I felt a strange warmth, a presence that I couldn't quite explain. I knew, deep down, that the spirits were still there, watching over the place that had once been their prison. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace, knowing that they were finally free. But as I turned to leave, I heard a soft whisper on the wind, a faint voice that sent a chill down my spine. Thank you. It started as a dare. We were sitting around Alex's apartment, watching horror movies and trying to out-scare each other with local legends. And then someone brought up the subway tunnel. Everyone knew the story. A tunnel abandoned in the 1950s after a series of disappearances. They said it was haunted, cursed even, that anyone who went in was never quite the same when they came out, if they came out at all. It was almost midnight when Alex suggested we check it out. My first instinct was to laugh it off, but something about the idea stirred something in me. Maybe it was the thrill of the unknown, the excitement of facing something that had terrified people for decades. Or maybe it was just the sense that, after all the stories I'd heard, I needed to see it for myself. We geared up with flashlights, a map, and a camera, planning to document our little urban exploration. As we approached the entrance to the tunnel, hidden behind an old maintenance building, the air grew colder, thick with a strange energy. The gate was rusted shut, but Alex managed to pry it open just enough for us to squeeze through. The moment we stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The darkness swallowed us, thick and absolute, pressing down like a weight. And as we descended into the depths, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The deeper we went, the colder it became, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and rusted metal. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows that flickered and danced along the walls. Every step echoed through the tunnel, amplifying the silence that seemed to stretch for miles. Halfway down the tunnel, we stumbled upon the first sign of life, or rather, the remnants of it. A worn, dusty jacket lay discarded on the ground, the fabric torn and frayed. It looked old, far older than any of us, and something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. Probably just a homeless guy, Alex said, but his voice was shaky, his bravado cracking. I didn't believe him. The jacket was too clean, too fresh, as if someone had left it there recently, maybe even within the last few days. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A faded name tag sewn into the collar, barely visible but unmistakable. It read, M. Grant. I remembered that name from the legends, a young man who'd gone missing in the tunnel decades ago. They'd never found his body, just his belongings scattered throughout the subway, like breadcrumbs leading into a dark, endless abyss. We exchanged nervous glances, our excitement replaced by a creeping sense of dread. But it was too late to turn back. We were too deep now, too close to the heart of the tunnel, and something told me that even if we wanted to leave, the tunnel wouldn't let us. As we continued down the tunnel, a strange sound filled the air, a faint murmuring, just on the edge of hearing. It was impossible to make out the words, but there was something familiar about the voice, something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. We all nodded, our eyes darting around the darkness, trying to find the source of the sound. But there was nothing, just the endless tunnel stretching out before us, dark and silent. The murmurs grew louder, clearer, like a voice calling from a great distance. And then, as we rounded a corner, we saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, his clothes tattered and worn, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching us with empty eyes. We froze, too terrified to move, too shocked to even breathe. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. We stood there, hearts pounding, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. And then, slowly, we continued forward, each step heavier than the last, each breath filled with the unmistakable feeling that we were being watched. Further down, we stumbled upon something we couldn't explain. The walls of the tunnel were covered in names, hundreds of them, scratched into the concrete with what looked like fingernails. Some were old, barely visible, worn away by time and decay. Others were fresh, as if someone had been there only days before. And there, near the bottom, was my name. My heart stopped. I hadn't told anyone we were coming here, hadn't even planned it until a few hours ago. But somehow, someone had known. Someone had carved my name into the wall, marking me as part of this place, binding me to the tunnel in a way I couldn't understand. I looked around, half expecting to see the shadowy figure again, but there was nothing, just the endless darkness and the silent, watching walls. "What is this place?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely a breath. No one answered. We didn't have the words to explain it, didn't know how to make sense of the horrors we were witnessing. All we knew was that we were trapped, caught in the web of something ancient and malevolent, something that wouldn't let us leave until it had what it wanted. And deep down, I knew it wanted us. We kept moving, the fear pressing down on us like a weight, each step bringing us closer to the heart of the tunnel. The air grew colder, thicker, the darkness closing in until our flashlights barely made a dent. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, echoing from somewhere deep within the tunnel. It was a sound that didn't belong, a sound that sent a jolt of terror through my body. We turned to run, but the tunnel seemed to shift, twisting and warping, leading us deeper into its depths. The walls pulsed with a dark energy, the shadows growing thicker, the air filling with the stench of decay and rot. And then we saw it, a massive, twisted figure, lurking in the darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was ancient, its form shifting and changing, its presence filling the tunnel with an overwhelming sense of dread. We froze, too terrified to move, too shocked to even breathe. And then, slowly, it began to move toward us, its massive, twisted limbs reaching out, its voice filling the air with a low, guttural chant. And in that moment, I knew we were doomed. We ran, the shadows closing in around us, the tunnel warping and twisting as we tried to escape. The creature's growls echoed behind us, its voice filling the air with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. Somehow, we found the entrance, the faint light of the outside world shining through the darkness. We sprinted toward it, our breaths ragged, our bodies trembling with fear. But as we reached the gate, I felt a cold, bony hand close around my wrist, pulling me back into the darkness. I looked up, and there, in the shadows, was the figure from before, its empty eyes staring into mine. For a moment, I saw its face, twisted and contorted, its eyes filled with a dark, unending hunger. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving me standing there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding. We stumbled out of the tunnel, collapsing onto the ground, the sunlight burning our eyes. But even as we stood there, safe and free, I couldn't shake the feeling that the tunnel had left its mark on us, that it had claimed a part of us. And as we walked away, I heard a faint whisper, echoing through the darkness, a voice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Come back. If you've made it this far, Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed what you've heard and want to hear more, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps the channel grow, and I truly appreciate your support.